Welcome to Off Message, the Chicago Sun-Times political talk show. I'm Kate Grossman, sitting this week for Natasha Korecki. Joining me today is Sarah Karp, deputy editor at Catalyst Chicago, Warren FitzPatrick, our education reporter, and Dan Mihalopoulos, our watchdog reporter and early and often columnist. This is a special edition of Off Message. Today we plan to dive deep into education in Chicago, my favorite topic. Let's start with the one-year anniversary of the vote to shutter 50 elementary schools. How have things gone in the schools that were absorbing these kids? Sarah, what do you think?
Well, on one hand, nobody that we know of was killed on their way to school or anything really horrible happened, so that's a plus. Right. Chicago Public School put a lot of money into safe passage, just having people stand on corners and watch out for kids, so that was good. I think welcoming schools did get a lot of resources. They got iPads, they got computers, they got libraries. The union is saying that, well, they got libraries but no librarians, they got iPads but weren't trained on how to use the iPads, and they're all sitting in a closet. I don't know how widespread that is, or if it's just sort of the union sort of pointing to the problems.
Yeah, Lauren, so the union put out a report basically saying it's been a bust and all these broken promises, and a couple months ago, CPS, Chicago Public Schools, put out a report trying to paint a more positive picture. How do you make these conflicting?
Nothing ever changes. CPS, Barbara Bennett declared victory at the end of March. The school closings have made the district stronger. This is wonderful. But she couldn't point to specific schools where there were great success stories or they did run into problems. The union was able to much more specifically look at certain schools and say, yeah, they got a library, but they couldn't afford to put a librarian in the post. Barbara Bennett also said this week that, well, I didn't promise any librarians, I just promised libraries. The truth is always somewhere in the middle.
I guess, from an outside perspective, Dan, I know you're not an education reporter, but such brouhaha last year over the school closings. And when you hear these competing images, what does it make you think?
Well, look, there's a highly politicized environment is what it makes me think, and there's plenty of bad blood over the first 3 years between the union and the administration of Rahm Emanuel, which runs CPS entirely. I like it when people say it's a sister agency because I don't know what kind of relationship some of you have with your sisters, but CPS takes orders directly from the Emanuel administration. And so there's a lot of issues still roiling and that will continue to play a factor going toward Emanuel's bid to run for another term next year.
So it seems pretty clear that the political repercussions are still felt. It's not as if Karen Lewis said, oh, well, the closings, I guess it's going okay, I'll just take a back seat this year. I mean, what has Karen Lewis been like this year as opposed to what she was like during the year of the closings?
Well, she seems like she's ramping up right now, especially as Rahm is ramping up to run again for re-election. There's a lot of rhetoric coming from the union. One thing that is sort of a big question that's still out there is whether the kids from closing schools actually went to better schools. And you saw in the Chicagoland on CNN, Rahm was saying, oh, they went to better schools, we had to do this, I slept fine the night before because I knew they were going to better schools. I don't think that in the end that will be the result. I think that they went to probably very similar schools as where they left.
So we had the strike 1 year, and then we had the school closings, and then let's talk a little bit about what we've seen this year. It's obviously been sort of a much quieter year. I mean, we all who've been covering the schools have found it a little more restful.
It's a little bit quieter. It felt like as soon as the school closings happened, the budget popped up. And, with CPS changing to this model of student-based budgeting where every school gets a fixed amount of money per child instead of sort of a number of positions based on enrollment, a lot of schools that we didn't hear from in terms of complainers in the district pitched a fit over losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. So all of a sudden it was a new batch of parents coming to meetings and uproar.
But really we don't know yet if CTU has gone through the sort of nuts and bolts motions to put together any sort of political machinery. I mean, we've seen they can be very effective in a strike situation and in other acts of protest and mobilization, but can they really become a force that can get somebody elected?
Well, they weighed in a lot in the state legislative races in the primary.
Certainly they were in support of Will Guzzardi, and both monetarily and with troops on the ground, campaign volunteers to help Will Guzzardi in the race where he beat Joe Barrios' daughter, the state rep, Tony Berrios, but then in other cases, for instance, against Christian Mitchell, they were not so successful. And the odd part about that race was that Tony Preckwinkle was with Christian Mitchell, who was seen as this sort of bane of the teachers union, champion of charters and whatnot.
Charters have become such a lightning rod in Chicago. Can you help explain why?
Well, one reason is because they keep closing schools, and so in some of the same neighborhoods where they close schools, they're putting new charter schools. People go to their neighborhood schools and they see that the resources aren't there, and then the charter schools look like they have much more resources, and they're not necessarily getting more resources from Chicago Public Schools, but there's a lot of private fundraising. The problem is that a lot of that private money, a lot of the political people are very much for the charters. They have a lot of money going into the charter schools, and so it sort of feels like the neighborhood schools are like the losing end of that stick, and so a lot of the parents who want neighborhood schools are not happy about that. In some cities across America, charter schools have come from the grassroots. Parents want them. In Chicago, that's never been the case. It's mostly been from the top, and I think that's one reason why there's so much conflict about them.
And in a perfect world where we were flush with money and there were enough for everyone to go around, then I don't think there would be quite the fight about charters as there is. But I mean, everyone's getting their budgets cut. You know, the district's constantly crying poor, so it's just a basic competition for resources, and the charters represent another competitor for a very limited pot of money.
You know, another big issue that's come up recently is we ran an op-ed from Troy Leverviere, who's the principal of Blaine Elementary School in Lakeview. You want to talk a little bit about what Troy had to say?
Troy had to say something at all, first of all. He opened his mouth and he signed his name to it, which is the rare principal that speaks up and says something critical and that isn't just warm and glowing and puppies and kittens. So he basically said that the Emanuel administration told principals what to say about all the Emanuel policies. And Troy said, no, like, we don't like it, a bunch of us. They keep giving us all these orders without enough money to fulfill them. And, you know, I served in the Navy. I was willing to give my life for this country, so I'll be damned if I'm coming home and censoring myself.
Yeah, and in the aftermath, some other principals have spoken up to echo what he said.
Under this administration, we have a lot of principals saying, you know, North Side principal said, because we can't get them to say it on the record, but a lot of them will say to us, you know, oh, I'm really unhappy about this. I don't have money for that. I'm trying my best under these circumstances, but they're scared. You know, they're really scared.
We're looking forward to the mayoral race next year. You know, this issue with principals saying we're not going to be silenced. How do you think that'll affect Emanuel?
From a public relations perspective, it's not good for Emanuel to be clashing with the teachers union, because you're talking about a community group that is very powerful and actually in a lot of respects reflected by its leader, and that we're talking about African American women. You know, when you talk about charters coming in and a non-unionized workforce, sometimes in other cities where there are more charters, we've seen that suddenly there is a smaller percentage of minority female teachers. That was the case, I think, in New Orleans. And so, yeah, it's an optics issue, and optics is what Rahm Emanuel is all about.
Right. Although the reality is Rahm has no contender at the moment, so there's lots of talk. What if Karen Lewis were to win? What if Tony Preckwinkle? No one.
You can't beat somebody with nobody.
Right. So, I mean, do you see you being able to turn this into find a candidate that can really run? I mean, there's certainly a lot of resistance to Emanuel, and we have an early and often poll that shows that Rahm Emanuel is very vulnerable, probably because of a lot of these issues that we've been discussing.
Tony hasn't said no. That's all I would say.
So we're going to wrap it up with our quotes of the week. My quote comes from Randy Weingarten, who's the head of the American Federation of Teachers. She spoke at the National Education Writers Association conference this week in Memphis. And she said, "It feels like the Chicago mayor wants to kick the public school system in the teeth every opportunity."
My quote comes from a California town where a mayor there was talking about an anti-bullying law that they're talking about passing, and he said, you know, bullying's bad, but you know, sometimes kids just need to grow up here. And a councilwoman answered, well, it's sort of hard to grow up here if you're a 10-year-old girl. So.
I went to the suburbs, to Oak Lawn, District 229, where 48 seniors were told, you're not graduating because you cheated on your community service requirement. 47 didn't do it. One was the guy, allegedly, who sold forgeries of signatures. And District Superintendent Michael Reardon said, "I think this is a great lesson, but a bitter lesson for them. There are consequences for your actions." Going out into the real world.
My quote of the week is, "Innovation in education does not require secrecy." This was a state senator, Jackie Collins, introducing legislation that would require greater scrutiny, greater transparency of charter schools. You still need to account for how you're spending public money, and let's remember, although they're privately run, they are publicly funded schools.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Off Message this week, and we'll see you next time.